Hi, everyone. I should probably be finishing the water pump on the Duramax behind me, but all in good time. In the interim, why don't we have a little bit of a conversation? I've been watching lately on social media, a lot of people are having what I would call crisis fatigue. They're getting burned out on all of the various calamities that have been the dumpster fire that is 2020. And of course, everybody has a different degree of ability to cope with these different, seeming bad news from all corners at all times. And everyone's exposure to the downside of everything that's happened this year is different as well. So it's understandable. The other thing that I've been noticing is a bit of a duality in how people view the government's response to things, in particular having to do with government expenditures. And so I've seen, I've got a friend on Facebook who posted the other day that they were thankful that their government had paid their wage while they were unable to work due to the lockdowns, but they were also concerned at the same time that this is going to have to be paid back by their child and maybe their children's children. And that's quite thought-provoking to hear someone actually say that, because you don't often hear people in the wild talking about deficit finance and the ethics of it when it comes to people who cannot give their consent today for that taxation, being the ones actually bearing the burden of that taxation. And it makes you wonder about how we will be viewed in the future if we overburden a bunch of people, arguably some who haven't even been born yet, with a tax burden, a debt burden. And how enslaving that is. I mean, that's an indebtedness that needs to be repaid. And there are international structures there to deal with insolvent countries. So I'll leave that where it is, but it's something to be considered. Either way, the individual citizen doesn't have a lot of say in how the government is going to respond to various crises, and so we don't have a lot of input when it comes to whether or not there's a lockdown or not, and whether or not our job is going to be deemed essential and not. And so on some level, I understand it, especially if you haven't been able to save up, 3 months or 6 months salary as a safeguard, which really people should do, but I understand that very few people do, that this all happens out of your control, and to have the government sort of say you can no longer work, in some ways kind of ought to come with, but we will help you during that period of time because this is our decision that's being made, not yours. However, again, when you have expenditures going crazy, and of course these all predate, in Canada and the US, they've both been deficit financing for a long time. In Canada, Justin Trudeau even ran on a platform of deficit spending, although he spent more than he said he was going to. That's something that's always bothered me, regardless of your position on the ethics of democracy. If a person comes along and says, listen, we're going to run a $10 billion a year deficit for X number of years, and then they declare that having been elected, that gives them the mandate to do so, I don't think it gives them the mandate to spend more than that. Food for thought. Anyway, what I think and what I fear is being lost in all of this and all of the cultural chaos that we're going through right now is any kind of sense for reasonable leadership. The libertarians among us might be the ones who would call for small, limited government that provides like a national defense and a protection of individual liberties and a few other things, maybe a couple of roads and not much more at all. If you look at the bloated size of our government and all the various programs and all the things they pay for, well, it's no wonder we run big deficits. You can't pay for all that stuff. I can tell you can't pay for all that stuff because we don't. We borrow it. And that's immoral, again, because we're foisting that debt burden onto people who cannot consent, and arguably some who haven't even been born yet, who will be paying these debts back if we don't get them under control. And so even the libertarian-minded among us, though, I think are minding their P's and Q's in the moment because we are in such a charged atmosphere. The election of Donald Trump was a bit of a FU to the powers that be that were ignoring a large swath of the American electorate. And I see, of course, everybody hates Donald Trump. I would submit a couple of things when it comes to the whole Donald Trump phenomenon. I hate being put in the position of having to defend Donald Trump because I don't particularly like the guy myself. However, I think I understand a bit better now than I ever did why he's in office. And the fact that most people who are focusing on Donald Trump are missing the entire plot. This isn't really about Donald Trump, and that's the point that people are missing. I would also submit that it might be wise, if you find yourself sort of uttering the same thing as everyone around you, you might be right, and they might be right too, but usually I think that's a good sign to just double check and make sure you're right. And by everybody around you, I'm talking about the media in particular, and of course, all of your peers as well. Because there's been a lot of media-driven narratives about Donald Trump. If you just look at the the Mount Rushmore press conferences and how they're treated differently and how statements are treated differently, depending on whether it's a speech given by a Democrat, let's say, or a speech given by Donald Trump, and listen to how they frame it. I'll leave that there, because again, I'm not interested in getting into a big defense of Donald Trump here, but I think you ought to really be aware of how much you're being manipulated, because you're being manipulated a lot. So what do I fear is getting lost in all of this with the BLM stuff and then all of the lockdown stuff? Well, any sense of a reasonably sized government, any sense of demanding as individuals that we stop deficit financing, that we stop allowing ourselves to be indebted to this degree, and allowing someone to just run roughshod over and just spending money like a drunken sailor. And to having a lot of programs that, quite frankly, are not necessary. They're not needed, and they all cost money. Typically, those would be the arguments you would be having between conservatives and liberals, or Republicans and Democrats, pick your flavors. But anymore, what's happening is, it seems to me, in particular on the conservative side of things, both in Canada and the US, there seems to be a real lack of backbone, with a very few exceptions on both sides of the border. There seems to be acquiescence to the status quo, if you will, and that concerns me. There doesn't seem to be anybody who's willing to actually go on record as saying they're here for the average citizen and they want to see a rollback of the largesse of government and to something more reasonable. Ultimately, I think, the old saying is that the politics can be divided into two camps, those who want to be left alone and those who won't leave them alone, and there's some truth to that. The size of government really ought to be concerning to us all, because what that represents, of course, is more meddling in our individual affairs. And what government really ought to be for is to protect our individual liberties, give individual freedom and thus responsibility to people, and not house it in government. The problem, however, right now is that things are so tense, they're at such a fever pitch, and that there are so many power dynamics that are shifting, that are underway here, that I think the libertarian-minded among us are just so afraid of the power shift being too great that they're willing to step aside, sideline the whole idea, the whole notion of small, limited government, just to keep the reins of power from being wrested from the current occupant, let's say in the United States, and handed over to an increasingly extreme left Democrat Party. Because they have a recognition, I think, for what that ultimately will mean. In the same way, culturally, we've got all these power dynamics going on as well. You might say that, of course, the Trump administration has the dominant power in the United States, but not culturally, I don't think. That seems to be right now to be held by the left when it comes to, obviously, most of the media, most of the entertainment industry, all of academia, almost without exception, in the youth, and in a lot of the groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And these are power dynamics. you can kind of tell that your government is too big when so many different groups are willing to lobby and put pressure on the government. That tells you that there is too large of a pie being handed out to everyone. And of course, the pie is larger than what it ought to be in the first place because a lot of it is deficit financed. It's all borrowed money. Ultimately, these groups are about gaining power. And I think what you need to understand is they want power over you. That's ultimately what this is about. This is about curtailing your individual liberties and freedoms. And I think the reason that a lot of libertarians right now are willing to let the libertarian principles step aside for the moment and try to preserve another 4 years of, let's say, a Trump presidency, or trying to figure out how in Canada we can have a more equitable voting system so that the West isn't always completely at the whim of the East, is because they sense the shift, they sense the tide that's about to roll over us all. And that is the tide of collectivist, Marxist, socialist dogma. This is interesting to me because I watched Tucker Carlson for a lot of years, and there used to be a fellow who was on there quite often, Richard Goodstein. He's a Democrat strategist. He had advised Bill and Hillary Clinton. And years ago, Tucker Carlson would have him on there, and he would be asking him about the latest sort of very radical left-wing statements made by someone like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar. And Richard Goodstein would mock him. He would scoff at the idea that that was representative of the mainstream of the Democrat Party. That no, the establishment, this is the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers, and they're having none of it. And that the mainstream Democrat voter was having none of that either. These are not representative of the party as a whole. Well, how times have changed. Now, Richard Goodstein doesn't come on to Tucker Carlson anymore. I'm not sure why. But the platform that was just announced by the Joe Biden campaign is a radical left platform. So he certainly couldn't scoff at Tucker anymore for presenting those things, for posing those things. And what I think a lot of people don't realize that's been taking place while most of us have just been going to work is that the far left has slowly merged itself in with the Democrat Party and pulled them left. Do a Google search. You'll find many, many people. Google search the phrase, "I didn't leave the left left me." There are many classical liberals who have woken up one day only to realize that their party seems to have left them behind. They've gotten continually more and more to the left, to the extreme left. And they've been doing this very successfully, very quietly. They have had a long march through the institutions. They've moved through academia. They've moved through the corporate structures. They have a lot of people implanted now in HR and in higher management in many large corporations. They've even infiltrated a lot of other areas where people weren't really paying attention. District attorneys is a good example. A lot of dark money has funded campaigns of very radical left-leaning people who have then gotten into positions of power in say, district attorneys, and then have completely upended justice in that area. And the main problem, of course, is that this is without the consent of the people. It'd be one thing if we were having a national or a regional conversation about these things and coming to conclusions as a group and then voting people in that were consistent with those platforms, those policies that we would like to see enacted. But that's not what's happening. It's a very undemocratic process. Yes, they've had the people elected democratically, let's say. However, there's some manipulation that's been taking place. And a lot of people, I don't think, have realized that this is happening. So again, I didn't leave the left left me. There are a lot of people, and you see this all the time, who think that they are on the right side of history. I think it's very arrogant, first and foremost. So, boy, there's so many things to talk about. There is now a sentiment on the left that we should not converse with people on the right anymore at all. That conservative principles are actually evil and immoral, and therefore we don't have a conversation with Hitler, and so we're essentially going to just eradicate those viewpoints by disengaging completely with those people. So don't think for a second that those won't be the platforms, the strategies that will be using if they ever do get a monopolistic power. I think that's what you will see. And it's easier now than ever before to do that. This has happened all throughout history, of course. But now when you've got social media, I just watched a fellow on TikTok today talking about how we need to gather together and we need to out these people on social media. We need to destroy their lives. And that's kind of the sentiment that's going on. And, people will scoff, and you can scoff now, but remember this later when it happens. People will scoff at things like the idea of mail-in balloting as being ripe for voter fraud. And then you have a little TikTok campaign, and I don't know about the truth of any of this, but in some ways it doesn't matter how accurate the reports are. A TikTok campaign to fill up a stadium during a Trump rally with people who actually, virtual attendees, people who won't be actually going there, right? A bunch of people who have no intention of attending, buying up all the seats so that Donald Trump would have a very empty stadium to play to. Now again, I don't know how accurate all of that is, but really it isn't important. What is important is the response by someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Twitter, congratulating these young people for their activism. Now, obviously, I don't need to tell you that this is an act of dishonesty. This is an attempt to create something that otherwise would not be by lying. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is giving it her blessing. How much of a jump, really, if you believe, see, she's doing this because she believes they're righteous. They're on the right side of history. Well, we need to have a fucking debate about that. You don't get to just decide. See, that's what the Enlightenment was about. You don't get to just decide. The burden is on you to prove your case, and we're going to have a debate about that, and may the best ideas win. But no, now the arena that we're in is declare my ideas superior, reject yours wholly, and that gives me carte blanche to do whatever I want. All is justifiable in the name of quelling your evil Nazi white supremacist notions. How far of a jump is it really from that, from encouraging and blessing these people for being dishonest on TikTok and creating false numbers, and voter fraud? And ethically, if you're going to make the case that one is valid, really the other is too, by that logic. Because the same thought processes, the same people are involved, right? Conservatives. Now, if you're on the left side of things, this might all sound really good to you. You might think, yeah, let's do that. We've swept in through the institutions, we've swept in through the corporations, we've swept in through media and through the entertainment industry. And yeah, if we got to stuff some ballots to do it, we are on the right side of history. We're the righteous ones. And all I would say to that is, you fucking arrogant prick. How dare you? How arrogant is it to think that through all of human history, you sit at the pinnacle of human thought? That none of your ideas need to face the rigor of being challenged by other people. Extremely arrogant, and I would say misguided, because obviously what you're not doing is viewing that in the context of human history. Because this is how it's done, people. This is how freedom gets eradicated, is by people deciding unilaterally that they have the goods, and that anyone who speaks out against them must be destroyed, for they are evil. And we do not communicate with evil people. There have been, around the United States and in Canada, there's all these diversity and inclusion seminars and workshops that people are having to go through in their places of work. And that would be one thing if they were just, be kind, be open-minded, don't treat people differently because of the color of their skin, but they're not. These are anti-whiteness training. There's one that's happened in Seattle, I think, in the public works areas there that was sort of exposed. And in these seminars, they talk about, it's amazing. It's amazing to listen to people self-detonate in their own admonitions to other people. So, all white people have this, of course. This is inescapable. It's a part of your makeup. But some of the things that they label as vestiges of racism within human beings, in particular in white human beings, so these are vestiges of racism and whiteness, and those are things like objectivity, those are things like individualism, those are things like perfectionism, and it's hard to imagine that someone could put that forth as though it's objective. Is that objectively true? Are you trying to, is not this idea that we are to purge our whiteness a form of perfectionism? Intellectualization, that's another one. So they're going to intellectualize to you about how you need to perfect yourself away from your whiteness, and it's objectively so. We can deem this knowing nothing about you other than the color of your skin, and simultaneously that all of these things, the perfectionism, the intellectualization, the objectivity, that all of that are vestiges of racism. These are vestiges of whiteness, which is highly racist anyway to begin with. To suggest that only white people care about objectivity, that only white people are concerned with doing things well, perfectionism. Thomas Sowell recently had his 90th birthday, and he was being interviewed and asked, why are I understand you're still writing all these books. And he said, yeah, I got a lot of things to do. I got a lot of things I want to say. I want to help people. Well, that's a fucking perfectionist. I don't plan on working on Duramaxes when I'm 90. I promise you that. Highly racist to suggest that individualism, intellectualization, perfectionism, and objectivity are vestiges of whiteness that need to be eradicated. This is what's coming your way. And it's here. It's here now. And so this is why I think that you have a lot of people who should otherwise be saying, hey, we cannot continue to run these unsustainable deficits. We've got to constrain our governments here. We've got to start shrinking things. We got to start cutting programs. We got to start cutting all of this fat, because we cannot, and if ever there was evidence of the fact that we cannot continue to run these large deficits and have governments that are this large, it's an epidemic like we've just faced. There's nothing there to weather a storm. So now when the storm comes, now we're really dipping into it. We can't do it. But in the face of all of these people, the will to power, this is what it is. This is a will to power. You've got many different people wanting to grasp that reign of power. And traditionally, when societies used to close, it used to be usually at the hands of a government. There might be a coup, but usually it would be somebody taking over the existing government. And now it seems like the closing of societies, and by that I mean, when I say closing of society, I'm talking about the restriction, the removal of individual liberties and freedoms, to come and go as you please, to run a business if you like, to take the profits that you make and invest them here or there, or to buy a houseboat, or to save for your own retirement, or to share, to buy another company, and to do with your assets as you please. When a society closes, it's usually been at the hands of a government. But when you've got so many of these other movements afoot that are willing, as they've said, to burn it all down in the seeking of an end, a Marxist, communist, socialist end, then you have a lot more at risk here. The minds of the youth have been corrupted, so you've got a lot here to lose, and you could very well see a power vacuum unlike we've ever seen before, because of course we've got the communication mediums that we have now, the internet and everything else. and also the long march through the institutions that has indoctrinated a lot of people to this way of thinking. So it's very dangerous. And again, lost in all of this is any kind of cooler head saying, hey, can we mute our governments here? Can we get this spending back in control? Because it's out of control and we can't weather a storm if one comes. We're indebting ourselves perpetually as it is. Now I know why people are having crisis fatigue. It's too much, isn't it? Ultimately, I think the average person doesn't really comprehend this will to power because they don't feel it themselves. I think the average person wouldn't want power if they had it. That would make them cringe, to have power over other people and to have it sort of thought that they have to make the decisions on how to govern millions and millions of people. And so because they can't understand it, I don't think they realize how strong the will to power is in some people. It's kind of a paradox, right? Because ultimately, really, the only people who should have power would be the people who don't want it. And the people who really seek power, those are the people who should never have it. With few exceptions, I think. There may be a few people who can actually handle that kind of power, but I don't think it's very many of us. And so what ends up happening is you've got a populace that's sort of complacent. We've sort of slowly built up to this degree of government spending and government intervention in our lives, and we don't notice it. It's the boiling pot with a frog in it sort of scenario, right? It just put us in there and didn't turn up the heat all that fast, so we didn't realize that the water was getting warmer and warmer. And now here we are. And now you've got other groups vying for that power. And make no mistake, in case this is lost on somebody, BLM is not about Black Lives Mattering. That's not what they are about. They self-affirm it, that they are trained Marxists. This is why the majority of their donations go to the Democrat Party. They're a political organization. They are not, they're utilizing the lives of black people to further their socialist agenda, their Marxist agenda. They seek to take power from a power vacuum derived through class struggle, class strife, class war, and in this case, the class is race. So, I'm not sure where we go from here, but what I did want to do is just sort of remind everyone of what's actually taking place here. You need to have, at the very least, two parties in it. Again, ethics of democracy aside, we live in a democracy. And for a democracy to be healthy, you need to have the two sides vying against one another. If the left is ever able to, through, again, the long march, the installation of people in various places, and as the Biden platform wishes to do, the opening up of borders, and the immediate granting of full citizenship to all illegal immigrants, then you will never see another conservative government be viable again. And again, I think there's a lot of liberals who think, good! Well, if you allow that to happen, at least we'll know who to hold responsible and accountable for the devastation that occurs, because it will be. If you think enforcing your way on other people is a mark of virtue, then I'm not sure how we were even raised on the same planet. Let me know what you think as always. I know this has been long and rambling, but these are just some thoughts that I wanted to get out there before they disappeared. Look forward to the communication in the comments below.